Hello, class. This lecture is going to be called Monarchy versus Democracy, Political Authority from Filmer to Althusius. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring the important topic of the central question of this lecture will be, where does political authority come from? Where this is a question that was heavily debated and written about for several centuries in the 16th and 17th century. And we're going to be looking at mostly the English tradition today, with the exception of Althusius, who was a German Reformed Christian writer. But we're going to be looking at the ways in which these men viewed political authority, where they believed that sovereignty, in other words, ultimately derived from, and the arguments that they laid forth in defending their own views of political structure. This is an important question because, of course, in the 17th century, this debate and the fundamental differences of belief in regards to political frameworks and where political authority came from, or where political authority lay, was the cause of the English Civil War. And some have argued, as Daniel Hannan did in his book Inventing Freedom, how the English-speaking people created the modern world. He noted that several scholars have come to believe that the American Revolution itself was a sort of second English Civil War, and that the ideological struggles that took place in the 17th century really culminated in the American Revolution. This question, where does political authority come from, was heavily debated by thinkers that we're going to look at in this lecture. Primarily, we're going to be looking at a thinker by the name of Robert Filmer, who in his work Patriarcha laid out an argument, a systematic argument for the divine right of kings, and that sovereignty ultimately, he argued, lay within divine right, monarchy. And we're going to be looking also at his contemporary Thomas Hobbes, who famously in his book Leviathan also argued for absolute monarchy in a somewhat different way, but a very similar way. And then Locke's two treatises of government, and the first treatise of government was actually a direct refutation of, attempted refutation of Robert Filmer's Patriarcha in his liberalism and his natural rights of man, from which a lot of the American framers got their ideas. And then finally, we're going to look at Johannes Althusius in his book Politica and his Christian federalism. And we'll talk more about that when we get there, because I believe that really plays a crucial point. And even though it is the earlier of all of these writings, it sort of ties them all together and is something that's very relevant for us today. So firstly, we're going to look at Sir Robert Filmer and his key work, Patriarcha. In this work, Patriarcha, he argues for patriarchal monarchy, and not just a descending patriarchy from Adam. He does argue for that. His biblical arguments for patriarchy come strictly from the Holy Bible, which is a very interesting thing. And one thing that you will notice in all of these writers is the extent to which that they rely on the Bible, less so in Locke due to his sort of Enlightenment rationalism, but especially in Hobbes, especially in Filmer, and especially in Althusius, the extent to which they rely on the Bible as not just an authority, not just an authority, a secondary source or to be referred to, but an actual authoritative historical document, not just something as to be referenced, but something that is absolutely authoritative. That's something very interesting in these thinkers. And so Filmer argues from Scripture, going all the way back to Adam, how that authority, political authority, descended from God to the patriarchs, and he argued for the divine right of monarchs in that way. His main idea was that the divine right of kings was modeled on this paternal authority, and his arguments for this again stem from Scripture, and he traces these monarchs, these patriarchs, all the way back to Adam, which are, from a Christian point of view, very persuasive. However, he does seem to use some ad hoc reasoning when it comes to the institution of monarchy in the Bible under Saul. And we won't go all into that, but he seems to understand that Israel, the Commonwealth of Israel, was a commonwealth without a king prior to becoming a monarchy under Saul, which the people famously requested from the prophet Samuel a king. They wanted to be like all the other nations. They wanted a king to go out and fight all their wars, and this came with lots of warnings from Samuel, from God, as to what all this would what all this would bring about, and the trouble that this would bring. And so, Filmer seems to sort of look over that in a way and use some ad hoc reasoning to say, well, it was always this way, it was always really this way, and what Samuel's really saying, or what God's really saying here, is that, and he believed that that obedience to monarchy, obedience to sovereigns, was a moral duty, and often even goes so far to say that even when one disagrees with decrees or doctrines or whatever it may be, that they still have a moral obligation to obey those kings as sovereign. And that's where, in my opinion, I think his arguments get a little ad hoc and get a little sort of begging the question. But he does lay out a pattern of in the Bible, using the Bible, a very obvious pattern in the Bible where authority, ultimate political authority, was always patriarchal. His critiques of democracy pull a lot from Aristotle and a lot from the ancients and the things that they understood about popular government, which was that it has a tendency to rebellion, a tendency to disorder, a tendency to chaos. Of course, the Greeks and Aristotle and Plato understood this well, and they believed that popular democracy would always devolve into tyranny, just because of its innate incoherencies and lack of political order and lack of strong sovereign control. And so his critiques of democracy are poignant and again, something that I feel is very, very relevant for today and typically very, very accurate. Thomas Hobbes, in his work Leviathan, and his main idea was also to defend absolute monarchy, but he was coming from a place where he believed that man's state of nature was inherently violent, inherently prone to warfare, and in a state of nature where people were left to themselves, they would always be self-interested. So he took a very negative, very negative view of human nature. Again, a lot of this comes from a Christian perspective on the fall of man and understanding that man is fallen and man needs order imposed upon him with laws and with sovereign leadership. And so without sovereignty, man in his state of nature would always become self-interested and devolve into warfare and anarchy. And so Hobbes used this theory of human nature to develop his theory of the total state, the Leviathan, which was under the sovereign monarch. His view was a little bit different than Filmer's in that he believed it was still, or Hobbes believed that this setup was still based on, to some degree, on the consent of the governed. He prefers monarchy over democracy, again, for its unity, its decisiveness. However, again, he allows for sort of more of a limited view of monarchy than Filmer, although not very much. His view of the social contract was that people had surrendered their rights to a sovereign, and therefore, to guarantee their peace and their security, to overcome this state of nature, which was prone to war and prone to violence, and they needed the security of the state, of the sovereign, for security and peace. And he believed that this was the main factor in the need for divine monarchy. John Locke wrote the two treatises of government, in which he argued for liberal democracy and the natural rights of man, and the consent of the governed and contractual government. This was a direct attempted refutation of Filmer's patriarchy. It was a response to patriarcha, and in this work, he argued for the natural rights of man to life, liberty, and property, and that government's main goal is to make sure that each individual is given through contract his inherent natural God-given rights to life, liberty, and property, which of course sounds very familiar to all of us Americans. And so he has a very limited view of government, in which the sovereignty is transferred, where Filmer and Hobbes have sovereignty in the monarchy from the top down. Locke's views and subsequent views of other Enlightenment thinkers were that sovereignty was with the people, that sovereignty ultimately rested in the people as a collection of individuals, and his attempted refutations of the divine right emphasized individual liberty and limited government. Lastly, Johannes Althusius argued for Christian federalism in his key work Politica, and he also argued for contractual government and limited government, decentralized authority, which found its authorities sovereignty based in a federalized community. However, his is different from Locke in that it is explicitly Christian, although Locke was also very Protestant. Althusius here is explicitly Christian and believed that man, in a lot of ways, Althusius was way more conservative, you could say, than even he was way more conservative than Locke, but way more conservative even than Hobbes or Filmer, because he just outright states in his work Politica that man is that equality is impossible, that it doesn't exist, that man is naturally unequal, that inequality is the state of nature, and therefore the only way that we can resolve inequalities, the only way people can live in harmony, or what he calls symbiosis, in a symbiotic community, is through Christian brotherhood and Christian community. So his idea is explicitly Christian in that it involves limited government, under a Christian prince with hierarchical principles, which still allows for the flourishing of the individual. So his is sort of the go-between, you could say, between Locke and Filmer. And I think Althusius' thinking is very relevant today. In today's modern political discourse, we see a lot of polarization, radical polarization between left and right. And we're beginning to see in certain segments of political discourse thoughts of things like Christian nationalism and a return to Protestant Christian government, and reinterpretations of the separation of church and state from a Christian perspective, what that originally meant and what it has become. The idea that what it has become is not what it was originally intended to be, in a total separation of Christianity from government. And Althusius represents, and could represent even today, a good model from a Christian perspective, which, even though on the timeline it comes way before Filmer and way before Locke, sort of a middle ground between those two thinkers. And Locke and Filmer are probably indicative of the really intense polarization that was taking place in England during that time period. Looking back at Althusius could be a way to rectify those polarizing tendencies. Thank you.